Packet forwarding. What are the two characteristics of a layer 2 Ethernet switch access port? Access mode is the default operating mode for a port on a layer 2 switch. This is correct. By default, each port is in the access mode belonging to VLAN 1. An access port is associated with a single VLAN, and this is also correct. So access port is indeed can only be associated with one VLAN. An access port uses 802.1q frame encapsulation. Trunk ports use 802.1q. Access ports require a switch virtual interface to be configured on the switch. This is not correct. A native VLAN is configured on each access port. This is not correct either. Native VLANs are configured on trunk ports. Which packet forwarding process uses ternary content addressable memory, TCAM? Hardware Ceph, software Ceph, process switching, complex packet switching. So TCAM is used by Ceph, and I think that should be the hardware Ceph implementation, because software Ceph, I believe, is the same as process switching, or it uses the CPU for processing. What is a feature of a Cisco switch virtual interface? An SVI is configured by setting it as a VLAN interface. Yes, that sounds correct. So SVI, or switch virtual interface, is basically a logical or virtual interface on the switch into a VLAN which exists on this particular switch. Other options are an SVI is configured by virtualizing a specified physical switch interface. That's not correct. One SVI is associated with the switch native VLAN by default. One SVI is no, by default there are no SVIs on the switch at all. So there is no VLAN 1 interface. Even and VLAN 1 is not even native, so it doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to be native, right? So this is not a correct option. An SVI is operational if one of the switch interfaces is associated with any VLAN. This is not a requirement for SVI to be operational. So SVI will work just fine, even if there are no any physical switch interfaces associated with a VLAN. Which Cisco router component performs process switching of packets? This is done by the general purpose CPU. So process switching is processed by the central processor unit. What is the difference between a routed switch port and a trunk port on a multi-layer switch? Okay. A routed port is assigned an IP address. This is correct. Yes, a routed port indeed can be assigned an IP address, but also and we need to compare with a trunk port. So yes, and that looks like a good option, because trunk ports, they don't have IP addresses assigned to them, as opposed to SVI. SVI has an IP address assigned, trunk port does not. So, and because we are here we are comparing the routed port and trunk port. Yeah, that's a good option. Let's check others. A router switch port forwards frames in multiple VLANs. This is not correct. It's just routed. It doesn't belong to any VLANs in the switching domain. A trunk port forwards layer 3 packets. Not correct. Trunk port just operates on layer 2. A routed port can be connected directly to switch access ports. Well, it actually can. A routed port can be connected directly to switch access ports. I see no problem with this option either, so need to choose between 1 and 4. Routed port can be connected directly to switch access ports. and the difference between routed switch port and trunk port. Routed port is assigned an IP address. Routed port can be connected directly to switch access ports. I like both these options equal. I see no problem why this is not correct. Well, normally you probably wouldn't do that. However, well, I'm just trying to think from the perspective of the enterprise topology and what the layer 3 links look like. Probably it would be more often that you connect, or kind of more typical that you connect a routed port on one switch to a routed port on another switch. So in order to establish a layer 3 link between the switches. However, there is nothing that would technically prevent me from connecting a routed port directly to switch access ports. Is it the same switch or is it in another switch? A routed port can be connected directly to switch access ports. Or is it does connected mean like connected by cable or something different? Okay, I think I'm going to assume that connected here doesn't mean connected by cable, but somehow internally in the switch connected directly to access port. So yeah, anyway, a routed port is assigned an IP address is a pretty straightforward, simple answer, and which is correct. I'll keep this one. What would be the source of the entries in the ARP table of a particular IPv4 host? Okay, the source of the entries will be the ARP responses from this particular IPv4 host. Let's find this option here. Devices that the host has communicated with recently that are on the same IP network segment. Yes, and this is a good option. So when my device doesn't know the ARP information, the MAC address of a device on my own network segment or my own subnet, it will send out the ARP request, and if successful, it will receive back the ARP reply. And this ARP reply will contain the information, the MAC address of the requested device. So basically, the entries in the ARP table will be populated based on the devices with which my device recently communicated. Okay, all devices that the host has communicated with recently. So this is different from first, just because it's the same IP network segment. And this is important. Yes, so ARP is based on layer 2 broadcast, and it is bound to the broadcast domain. So you would not be able to request for a MAC address of a device which is beyond your network segment, right? So not all devices. Only an entry for the device that is the next hop to reach the remote network. So next hop is one of them, but also other hosts or computers maybe in the same domain will also be a source of information to populate the ARP table. And finally, devices that the host has communicated with recently that are a remote IP network. This is plainly incorrect. So it's the first option here, same IP network and communicated recently. Which is the correct description of a native VLAN on a Cisco switch? A native VLAN, okay. The VLAN that contains any untagged network traffic on a trunk port, and this is correct. So on trunk port, we have frames being tagged with the VLAN numbers, VLAN ID, but any frames which happen to be just plain 802.1, 802.3 Ethernet, they just they just assume to be belonging to the native VLAN. So this is the correct option here. So the others are the VLAN that is always used to manage the switch, not correct. The VLAN that is assigned to the switch SVI by default, not correct either. There is no default assignment for SVI. You must, when you create an SVI, you must specify which VLAN it belongs to. The VLAN that has a VLAN ID of 0, such VLAN ID does not exist at all. VLANs start from number 1. Which router memory component is used by Ceph to make packet forwarding decisions? All right, forwarding information base, and this is the correct answer. So forwarding information base is lower level kind of cache of routing decisions, which is built based on the routing information base, which is in its turn, it contains the routing table. Where does a Cisco switch store the MAC address table entries? So switch does switching, and it stores MAC address table entries in the CAM table, content addressable memory. It's a special kind of memory which allows a very quick lookup for information based on the specific address we want to look up for. So what it does is, I understand it somehow hashes the MAC address when it stores value, and using this hash of the MAC address, it's very quick to extract the information we want. And information we want is pretty straightforwardly just the port, the port of the switch to which this MAC address associated. Okay, which Ceph component enables multiple actions to be performed in addition to allowing or dropping traffic? Ceph component enables multiple actions to be performed. Okay, so adjacency table is kind of cache for ARP. TCAM stores all these pre-built information for routing, as well as TCAM is used to when packet switching is needed, right? And when switching based on layer 3 is needed, and also QoS or ACLs need to be checked. So multiple actions to be performed in addition to allowing or dropping traffic. Yeah, I'll say TCAM, and here I will assume multiple actions mean things like checking QoS, maybe checking ACL and things like that. What is a feature of virtual LANs, VLANs? Logical segmentation is provided by creating multiple broadcast domains on a single switch. Yeah, kind of, but not necessarily just one single switch, because it spans across multiple switches, across all the switch network. So let's check the other one. A single collision domain is enabled on a switch that is shared between VLANs. Doesn't make any sense. Communication between different VLANs in the one switch is enabled by default. No, by default, or actually by principle, different VLANs, they cannot and should not be able to communicate with each other. Switch port utilization is decreased because each port is only associated with one broadcast domain. This is not correct. This is probably routed switch ports or something like that. Yeah, so definitely the best option here is option 1. However, I would also add that it is not necessarily just a single switch. It spans across multiple switches. And the last question is, what are 2 characteristics of layer 2 Ethernet trunk ports? Okay. Trunk ports carry multiple VLANs. Yes, that's what they do. Trunk ports connect a switch to other switches or to other network devices. Yes, this is quite typical. So, because we want to be able to, again, span these VLANs across multiple switches and routers as well. So up to a router device. Other options should be incorrect. Let's check. Trunk ports ensure that broadcast communications are contained within one switch. That's not what we want, right? We want broadcast to work across all our switched network. However, we want broadcast to be isolated within their respective VLANs. Trunk ports automatically load balance data traffic between network devices. No, they don't do that. Trunk ports are only used to connect to network end devices. No, in order to connect network end devices, we use access ports. Let's see.